Hello and welcome back. Welcome to week 8. So last time we looked at the Roman East, the provinces in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and today we are going to be looking at the Roman West, so the provinces in the west half of the Roman Empire. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of a review of last time because I know I threw a lot of things at you. And there was a lot to take in, lots of different sites. So I just wanted to go over some overarching themes that we see in the Roman East. So some of these hopefully sound familiar, but Collinated Streets is the first one. So we looked at places like Palmyra, Jerash, places like that had colonnaded streets. And these are especially prevalent in the Roman East because there's a lot of desert locations. So it gets very hot there, and colonnaded streets allowed for porticos to be built along the streets that would provide some shade. So you wouldn't be walking right underneath the direct sunlight. You had some shade to walk through, and also it allowed for shops to line the streets as well because the shops could kind of set up in those porticos. And so that allowed for an extension of the commercial activity of the forum to extend into the streets and into the rest of the city. So colonnaded streets, something that we mainly see in the eastern provinces. Another thing that we saw was a lot of port cities. So we looked at multiple harbor towns, places like Zeugma, Ephesus, and these are really centers of trade because of their locations on prominent waterways. And they linked Roman commerce with also other cultural centers. So for instance, at Zeugma, we saw that it linked the Roman world with the Parthian world. But a lot of times these port cities, because they were centers of trade, would become very, very wealthy. And so that was why, for instance, again, at Zeugma, we saw those really lavish mosaics. They were really well done. We see big villas that probably belonged to people associated with the trading industry. So it really provided a way for people to become very wealthy and then therefore have very lavish art. The next one is that we saw a little bit of a deviation from the traditional Roman norm of triumphal arches and temple design. So we still saw triumphal arches and temples, but they were done in a more of an Eastern style. So we see characteristics that are often common to Assyrian art, even Parthian art, that kind of part of the world, influencing the design here. So we have a real blending, and that kind of goes back to the bottom bullet point that you see, that an idea of incorporating local traditions with Roman culture. So these kind of hallmarks of art of Eastern design, things where we have like broken pediments, we have niches for statues, multi-level structures where there's the arch and then the pediment on top, right? All these things that we see primarily in Eastern cultures are now being blended with Roman architectural forms or monument forms to create a kind of unique style, something that's not quite Eastern, not quite Roman, but something uniquely in the Roman East. Something else that we see, funerary portraiture. So we looked at that. We see funerary portraiture all over the Roman Empire, and we're going to do a little bit more in-depth look at funerary portraits later on in the class. But here we looked at ones from Palmyra and from Fayum, which you see on screen. And in both of these, we see a lot of individualization. So we see portraits that look like the people who have died. They look like the deceased. They're commissioned specifically for these people. We also see their appearance indicating what they were in life. So whether it's elaborate jewelry, sometimes there's multiple strands and each one is different, and it's a big sign of wealth to show that the person was wealthy. Other times it's just the simple outfit that they're wearing. Perhaps they're dressed as a priest, and so we can tell that they were probably a priest in their lifetime. All these kinds of things that indicate what they were like in life. So that's again pointing to the idea of individualization, that their facial features, especially on the Fayum portraits, are individualized. Their coloring, whatever it might be, looks like them, but also what they're wearing indicates who they individually were. And then also we have the reclaiming and refounding of existing ancient cities into Roman cities. And this was mainly, we saw this at Athens and Jerusalem. In both cases, Hadrian kind of takes over the city, decides that he wants to be seen as its new founder, and totally redoes it, redesigns it, or just adds monuments. Athens wasn't so much totally redesigned as Jerusalem was, but Hadrian definitely introduced new forms of construction or new places in the city that were distinctively his and that kind of led to a new Athens, that the Hadrian's Arch marking the two parts of Athens. And then in Jerusalem, it gets a whole new name and a whole new layout. So this idea of taking old ancient cities, and a lot of times ancient cities that were centers of power, as both of Athens and Jerusalem were, like quite large cities with a lot of influence, the Romans take those, and I think it's almost a display of their power, them saying that these are no longer powerful cities, they are now Roman cities, and they are under our jurisdiction. We are the reigning power in the Mediterranean. So Athens and Jerusalem get a little bit of demoting in a way from their former status. And then lastly, skinographic architecture. So we talked about this. Skinographic architecture refers to architecture that looks like it could be at a theater. So when we see a skene franz and it's really lavish or elaborate, these backdrops that are very architecturally detailed, we start to see them, especially in the Roman East specifically, bringing that into their architecture as a whole. So we see it at Ephesus most clearly with the library, but we see it a little bit at Petra in Jordan too, that it looks a little bit skinographic. And so it looks a little bit theatrical. It's very over the top and expressive, so we can also call it Baroque, but skinographic specifically refers to the similarity that it shares with theaters. So that's a little bit of a recap. Those are kind of the main things that you should take away from the Roman East, and you should be able to point to specific examples, as I've done, to back up these main ideas. And a lot of them, I think all of them, do have multiple examples that you can point to as these trends that we see across the Roman East. So moving now to the Roman West. So that's what we're going to be looking at this time. And just to remind you of the geography, so we started in Greece last time, and then we kind of made our way like this, so almost in a clockwise fashion, went across to Asia Minor, and then down to the Levant, and then into Egypt in Africa. And so we're going to be continuing that trajectory in the clockwise motion, and we're going to be coming into North Africa. But I wanted to tell you in advance a few things to look for, like we just did with the Roman East. A few things to kind of think about while we talk about the Roman West. And some of these, like the use of above ground tall aqueducts, are very clear, very evident. I mean, the infrastructure like that is seen a little bit more in the West. So we'll talk about that. Those ones are very obvious, but there's a couple more that are, you have to kind of think a little bit more about and really notice the details. So one of them is this emphasis on the military. And this is because although Rome had to conquer the whole Mediterranean, had to do battles everywhere, and we've talked a lot about their dealings with the Parthians. The borders on the eastern half of the empire were a little bit more secure, not totally more secure. There was still skirmishes happening there, but for the most part, it was stable in a sense. But in the western half, we really see a lot more conflict along the borders, especially with Germanic tribes and with indigenous British people, so British tribes. And so because of that, we're going to see the formation of military garrisons, and we're going to see many troops stationed there for long periods of time, and that's going to lead to these settlements of soldiers in the West. And we do see that in the East, but it's a bit more prevalent in the West because I think it was a little bit more under threat. So because of that, it really influences the architecture that we see, the city planning that we see, the art that we see. And so just continue to think about that, and I'll bring it up a lot, but this emphasis on the military, and really just the presence of the military, how present the Roman military is in the West. And then the other one, similar to in the East, we see traditional Roman forms exported to the West, and sometimes, like we saw in the East, we see variations on these forms to make them distinctly Western, but in the West, we'll see a little bit more of traditional forms. So not as much variation as in the East. The West is going to keep it a little bit more traditional, a little bit more similar to what's going on in Rome. So just some things to look out for. We're going to start, as I said, in North Africa. So we're going to start with Carthage. And Carthage is an ancient city. It was actually an ancient enemy of the Romans. So I don't remember, I think we mentioned the Punic Wars in this class, which were fought during the Republic pretty early on in Rome's history. And so the wars with Carthage, Carthage was another civilization, essentially, another power, another culture even, and they were located on the very tip of North Africa. So you can see them here in modern day Tunisia, and they're really close to Sicily. And so that caused a lot of problems because the Romans and the Carthaginians were fighting over Sicily, and that was largely what the First Punic War was about. And then the Second Punic War was kind of a redevelopment of those same issues popping up again, not necessarily about Sicily, but just again, this conflict and trying to be the naval power in the Mediterranean. And the Second Punic War is going to feature Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants coming from Spain all the way up to the north of Italy, and having elephants that he crosses the Alps with, which is kind of an infamous event in history, not even just Roman history, just in history in general. But the Romans do defeat the Carthaginians, and that's a real turning point for the Romans, because it cements them as powers in the Mediterranean, as the power in the Mediterranean, whereas Carthage had kind of been a rival for that. So we see them defeat the Carthaginians, and then a little bit later on, Carthage as a town, because Carthage is kind of the same way as Rome, so it's the name of the town, but it's also the name of the civilization or the culture. But in 146 BC, they're going to conquer Carthage, actually its own territory, and turn it into a Roman province. And at this point, the Carthage culture is kind of going to end, and it's going to really become a Roman province in the traditional sense of the word, where it's going to have a lot of influence from Roman culture, and specifically in its urban design. So that's a kind of a shift that we see, and you might notice if you're really paying attention to dates that 146 is also the year that Greece is captured and Corinth in particular. So that was a big year for Roman expansion, conquering two of its biggest rivals. So let's look a little bit at Carthage, the Roman Carthage. So this is not ancient Carthage, this is Carthage redeveloped after the Romans take it over. And you'll see probably right away that it sits heavily on a grid system. And I know we talked a little bit about this with Pompeii, and a little bit maybe about how there's a lack of this at Rome, but the Romans really favored the grid system. This was a characteristic of Etruscan cities way back. And if you think about the necropolis that we looked at, multiple necropolises that we looked at, they all sat on grid systems, and so that's kind of a sense of how the towns were set up too. So big fans of the grid system, and when they would go into provinces and implement new cities or take over, a lot of times this grid system would be implemented. So we saw that at Jerusalem as well. And also closer to home, we saw it at Pompeii, right? Pompeii sits on a grid system. So very common, see it all over. But this is a bit of an extreme example in that it is very neatly gridded. It is a textbook grid with a little variation. And something else that you can notice is there is the Cardo. So this is going to sit kind of north-south in a way. We have the Cardo here, and it leads right into the Forum. And then there's not a super clear Decumanus, but you could maybe argue that it's one of these that maybe leads out of the city. I can't tell on the map if there's a gate somewhere. There probably is, though, because that was pretty common in these towns. And that would meet in the Forum. So we see the Forum right in the center of the city, in the heart of the city, as the downtown. And then there's these main streets that lead right into it. Most notably the Cardo. But we also see other hallmarks of Roman cities. So there's an Odeon down here, so a little bit of a theater, and that looks like a bigger theater there, so kind of a large theater, small theater situation again. We also see a stadium, so that would be for races, like the Stadium of Domitian we looked at. So they get a stadium as well, and that's kind of important because stadium racing and that kind of sport was a Roman sport. That wasn't really something that other cultures had. So we even see that's more of a cultural, import in a sense. The fact that that's an entertainment form that is being introduced here. Carthage, very, very Roman looking now, although it did not way back when it was fighting the Romans, but when the Romans take over, they turn it into a Roman town. Carthage is also important, ancient Carthage, I should say, because it's featured in the Aeneid. So the Aeneid is that story written by Virgil in the reign of Augustus, and it details the travels of Aeneas as he leaves the Trojan War. He's a hero in the Trojan War, which is the big war between the Greeks and the Trojans. It's kind of an ancient mythical war. And so Aeneas is one of the heroes from this kind of mythical hero, and he sets off after the Trojans are defeated because he can't stay in the city because he would probably be killed because he's a Trojan, and the Greeks have won. So after the Greeks take over Troy, he flees and is sailing around, and one of the places that he comes is Carthage. And Carthage at that time, or the time that the Aeneid is set, is also being founded. So as he gets there, the city is being built, and he meets its queen, Queen Dido, and the two of them have a relationship, and we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later on in this lecture. But just another important part about Carthage is another way that it kind of registered on the Romans' minds, and it was kind of this mythical enemy. And then we also see it in the Aeneid. So a common culture that the Romans have now taken over, turned into a Roman city. If we continue on, so kind of up the coast a little bit more, we are now in Timgad. So Timgad is in modern day Algeria. It was not an ancient city. So whereas Carthage was, it was, its own culture, as I said, its own kind of civilization, and it was changed into a Roman city, similar to Athens or Jerusalem. This was a brand new city. So it was founded by Trajan. It has a really long name, and I think one of the names is actually like Trajan's. It's like they're like of Trajan is like one of the parts of it. And it was founded in 100 CE. So this is kind of interesting because of that, because it's a brand new city. And a lot of times, I mean, even in the East we were looking at, there was lots of cities that were ancient and were being taken over by the Romans. This is a brand new one. And so we can see, though, that even when they would found a brand new city, they would still put it on the grid. So it's still on a grid system. And it is, again, very neat. And perhaps because they didn't have to build over an existing city. So like in Jerusalem, the grid isn't quite perfect because there were things already there that they kind of had to build around. But if you're just coming to a new plot of land and you can build whatever you want, you're going to build a perfect grid. And that's what we see here, pretty much a perfect grid system. We also see characteristics of Rome. So we see a theater here, a Capitolium, which is a temple to Jupiter, right? The Capitoline trio. So we see a temple to Jupiter here. What else? We have the Decumanus and the Cardo. So the Decumanus there, you can see it, it's defined there. And like I said, the Cardo and Decumanus always have gates. So that's why I was looking for it in Carthage. I was like, where's the gate? Because that's how you can tell. So here's the Cardo, F is the Cardo, and then D is the Decumanus. And they both have gates leading in and out of the city. And then they pretty much meet at the Forum. So there you go. H is the Forum. And it's always right in the middle. So that's kind of, in a perfect world, the Cardo and Decumanus will meet in the middle. And that's where the Forum is. We also see a basilica, we see a curia, baths, markets, a library. So all of these things that we see in Roman cities everywhere, but we see it very intentionally done, very neatly done here, and that it looks very precise because it was planned from the ground up. They didn't have to build over anything. There are some great ruins there today, as you can see. Lots of archaeology to go look at, and it's pretty well preserved. It wasn't a city in later history as much. I think it was taken over and then kind of abandoned, so we have some pretty good ruins from it. Something else important to note about Timgad, though, is that when it was founded as a military colony. So it was set up for veterans, and this is something we see a lot. So many men in Rome were part of the military, served in the military, and a little bit like it is now, you got really good benefits if you were in the military. In exchange for your military service, you would often be given land and some kind of wages as well, almost like a pension. So you would usually get land, though. But the issue is that they started giving land to people in Italy, and then they kind of ran out of land because as Rome goes on and there's more and more soldiers, there's only a limited supply of land. So what they started doing was setting up these colonies like Timgad across the empire. And they would say, even if you were living in the middle of Rome, they might say, well, yeah, we're going to give you some land, but it's in Algeria, it's in North Africa, so you have to move. But a lot of people would do it because having land was a really big deal. It kind of secured your economic prosperity. You could, farm or do whatever. So people would often take that deal, take the land, and move to these veterans colonies that would really be the majority of the people who lived there were all people who did the same thing as you. They had gotten land here and moved to North Africa in this case. So we see a strong military presence here, and that most of the people living in the town were probably veterans now trying to live their life after being in the military. So one of the biggest things that we see today in the standing remains is this triumphal arch. So I want to move now to look at that a little bit closer. So it's called the Arch of Trajan. It is in Timgad, and it dates to about the same time that the city was built, so about 100. And it's called the Arch of Trajan because, as I said, Trajan founded the city. So he gets his own arch in the city. The arch, interestingly, is made of sandstone, which is kind of new. We don't really see that in other places in the empire, but that is a local stone, I believe, to North Africa, and so they used sandstone to build this. So already kind of a unique thing about it that we don't see elsewhere, kind of a local tradition, you could say. It is of the Corinthian order. So it's a triple bayed arch. It has those 3 bays, those 3 arches, and the biggest one is in the center. It's 11 feet wide, so it's pretty large, the middle one, and another 2 are a little bit smaller. Something else that we see, so we see above the 2 side arches, we see niches that would have held statues. So as I said, that's kind of an Eastern trait to have these niches for statues. And then we don't see a broken pediment, but we do kind of see some decoration on top. We kind of see these arched decorations, I guess, which kind of take the place of a pediment a little bit, and that they're kind of the crowning feature of it. But it is not, it would not be the highest thing on it. So as you can see in this reconstruction, it would have had a sculptural group on top. So it would have had some kind of statues, which was common in Rome. So we see that a lot because in Rome, we have flat-topped triumphal arches. So in the East, I have a slide for this. In the East, a lot of times we see the triumphal arches being topped by a pediment, and often a triangular pediment. So that's what we saw at the Arch of Hadrian in Jerash. We see a triangular pediment, and then this one was kind of fronted by that broken pediment. So it kind of had 2, actually. But in Rome, we always see flat-topped triumphal arches, and this is because they would want to put that sculptural group on top. So they would want to put some kind of statue, and usually it was, like you see here, it was horses. It was usually the emperor or whoever the arch was dedicated to in a chariot being pulled by horses. That was kind of a common thing to put on top. So that's what we see here. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this is a bit of a conglomeration of Eastern triumphal design and Roman triumphal design, in the sense that it has a flat top and it would have had the sculptures on top. So that's like Rome. But it would have been it would have had these niches for statues, which is very Eastern. We don't see that in Rome. And then it also has things that we see in both. So like the idea of a Corinthian order, of these columns, all of these have Corinthian columns. And then the fact that it's triple bayed, although that looks like a similarity, we will see that later on in Rome. So that's something that's kind of all over the place, the idea of a triple bayed arch. But as I said, sandstone is something kind of unique to Timgad because it's more local. So lots of interesting stuff here. We see a lot of similarities, but we also see differences that are local differences versus the imperial design. So whereas this one looks pretty Eastern, this one looks pretty Roman, this one's kind of a blend of the two with a little bit of its own design as well. So that is the Arch of Trajan. I want to move out of North Africa now. So we're going to move into Spain. So if you can picture the Mediterranean, right, we're going up into Spain across the Rock of Gibraltar, up into Spain. And this is Augusta Emerita. It is in Merida is the name of it today, Merida, the modern name of the city. It was founded in 25 BC by Augustus, thus the name of it. And it was, again, like Timgad, founded for veterans and military troops. So this was another place that if you were in the military, you might get to live after your service. And it was specifically built after the Battle of Actium. So I think it was specifically for people who had fought in the Battle of Actium and were now kind of discharged from the army, like weren't in the army anymore after that battle. They were now given land and given a place to live in Augusta Emerita in Spain. So kind of a thank you for their help in defeating Antony and Cleopatra. Let's see, what else? So this was also, like I said, because it was a veteran city, it was founded from the ground up. That's why it's named after Augustus. It's hard to see today because unlike Timgad, which I said was abandoned, and so we have really good archaeology there, this was a continuous city. It's even a city today. So we're contending here with between the archaeology and the modern day buildings. So it doesn't look as neat. We can't see that grid system as perfectly. But we do have some remains from it, some remains that look very, very Roman. So the biggest thing that is left today are the centers of entertainment. So that primarily includes the theater. So we see the theater here. Do we see it on the map? Yes, yeah, that's right. It's right here. So we have the theater with its skene fronds and its cavea for people to sit. We have an amphitheater here. And then we also have some infrastructure. So this is a bridge going across the river. And then we also have a temple to Diana, I believe. So that's Artemis in the Greek. So a temple to Diana here. That's what you're seeing there. Looks like a pretty standard Roman temple. So something else that it has, though, that we haven't necessarily seen elsewhere is something specifically called a hippodrome. So you'll see that word right here, hippodrome, and that's going to be this one on the map. That's the stadium looking thing. And a hippodrome essentially is a stadium, but it's a specific type of stadium where it's just for horse races. And hippo is the Latin word for horse, which is kind of funny because we think of like a hippopotamus. So it's not hippopotamus racing, although that would be pretty fun. It's horse racing. And so that's what we have here. It's a stadium specifically for horse racing. So it wouldn't be for anything else. And so that's called a hippodrome when it's a stadium just for horse racing. And that's what we have here in the city. If we take a closer look, it's kind of cool because the theater and the amphitheater are right next to each other. So it almost creates a type of entertainment complex in the sense that this is all sort of an entertainment area. I don't know, it made me think of if you've been to LA and like the Staples Center, and it's all around, it's like LA Live is there and the Staples Center. And so there's these theaters, I guess, like entertainment venues for, they do awards shows and stuff there, but then right next to it is the Staples Center. And so it's all downtown. They're kind of like, it's a one big entertainment hub. And so that's what we see here is that they're right next to each other. So all of the fun parts of the city are nearby. And then if you look at the larger picture, the Hippodrome isn't too far away as well. So kind of just, again, the idea of building from the ground up, the fact that we don't have to fit in like an amphitheater here, a theater here, we can plan it and we can think about it and actually, come up with a logical way to do it, which is that we want to put all of our entertainment venues in the same place. We want to put them next to each other because that kind of makes sense. So a little bit more planned than some other ones that we've looked at, some other cities that we've looked at. The theater and the amphitheater also are pretty elaborate examples of provincial architecture. So as I said, the skene fronds is quite large and well preserved, and the amphitheater was pretty large as well. So the theater would have held 15,000, which is a pretty good size. So for something being all the way out in Spain, although this is a veterans colony, it kind of speaks to how big the city was and how big it was planned for also, right? How many people they planned to have there. And the amphitheater and the theater date to actually 8 to 16 BC, so a little bit after it was founded, but not too long, maybe 10 years after it was founded. All right, let's move on. So staying in Spain, I want to look at some infrastructure. So some of the most impressive remains that we have are aqueducts. And so this is an aqueduct. It's from Segovia, Spain, dates to the 1st or 2nd century CE. And you can see it is just massive. I mean, it is dominating the landscape even today. And so you can imagine how it would have been back in the Roman period. But as I said, this is an aqueduct. So it is a primarily practical piece of architecture. It is a functional work of architecture. The aqueducts, I think we've talked about, are a lot of times they would be underground, and even today they're almost all underground. But in the Roman world as well, a lot of times they were underground and they were built through that tunnel system. And so you can kind of see an example of that here. But other times they were bridges. And so when they are bridges, they are quite tall, quite elaborate, and they have multiple levels of arches. So in this case, we see a 2-tier bridge like we have in the illustration, 2 levels of arches. And aqueducts, just to remind you, their function is to bring water into a city for the population. So it would be connecting a body of water and the city. And the way that it works is essentially has to do with the fact that water is hydrophilic, so it likes itself. It wants to stick together. It wants to stick with other water. And so it relies on a system of gravity, basically. There's not anything too complicated here. It's just gravity and the properties of water, and that water will flow downhill if it's being brought by gravity, obviously. But it'll also, if it has enough momentum behind it, and because it is hydrophilic, it can also flow uphill. So that's what you can see here, the fact that it's going down and then back up. If you go downhill fast enough, you can kind of go uphill again because water will stick to itself. Again, not an engineer, so some of you who are engineers out there probably understand this or can explain it a little bit better than I can, but that's basically the basics of it. So the water itself would flow along the top here. It would have like a little bit of a channel, and that's where the water would flow. So it's good because it keeps it safe too, keeps it out of getting contaminated. You know, you don't want your water flowing right through the city because I think we've established that Roman sewage was not very well managed. And so if you're having your fresh water running along the ground, there's ways that it can get contaminated. So here we have it being built into a very tall two-tiered arched bridge for the water to flow, and we can see similar to how we've talked about at the Colosseum, the things that are doing the work there are the arches. So the fact that the arch can bear so much weight enables this building or this aqueduct to stand and to withstand so much time as well. It's a very sturdy structure because of that arch design. That's the last thing we're going to look at in Spain, but not the last aqueduct. So I want to go now to France. France, which was called Gaul back then, so kind of comes from the Gallic tribes. The people there were Gauls, and so the ancient name for it was Gaul, but today we call it France after the Franks, who were later people. This is the Poncho Guard. So this is another aqueduct, but it looks a little bit different. So if we looked at this one in Spain, we can see that there are 2 tiers of arches, but in Gaul or France, there are 3 here. So we see 3 rows of arches, and this one is actually considered a little bit less developed. We're still working on the engineering. The 2 tiers, that system is a little bit more developed, a little bit more advanced, because you'll notice that the arches are shorter here. So each of them still impressive. I mean, these are still very large arches, but when you compare to just how tall these lower arches are, you see that there's a little bit of a development. So this one is going to be a little bit later than the one that we just looked at in France. But this is also an aqueduct. What else do I want to say about this? So it was also in an area where veterans were being settled by Augustus, same kind of time period as Augusta Emerita. It was erected specifically by Marcus Agrippa and is both an aqueduct and a bridge. So although all aqueducts kind of look like bridges, this actually is a bridge because it goes over water. So it doubled as that, and you could actually walk along the middle portion of it as a bridge, and then the water would flow along the top portion of it. So a dual function piece of architecture here. In terms of how this was built, so we haven't really talked about actually construction methods yet, which is probably what you're wondering. So builders would have used cranes and pulleys essentially to lift the stones into place. So there would have been a massive set of scaffolding all around it, scaffolding set up, and this is kind of holds true for any Roman building. A big scaffolding set up, and then they would use cranes and pulleys to lift these heavy stones into place. So it was all human powered essentially. And you can see that, yes, so these blocks that I'm pointing out here, you can see these ones that are sticking out actually would have been used to support the scaffolding. So they were built to hold up the scaffolding as they were working above it. You can kind of see them from here. And so those were left in. That was just part of the design, I guess, and that they needed those for scaffolding, and then they just got left in after the arch or after the aqueduct was built. And so we still see them today. But that's kind of a hint at how this was built, with a system of scaffolding and then pulleys and cranes, just using human manpower to lift it into place. Next up in France, we have Orange. So Orange, also in Gaul, France, either way, you can call it either thing. This is the Arch of Tiberius. It is named for an inscription on the arch that mentions its dedication to Tiberius. It dates to 25 CE, so that would also be under Tiberius's rule. It is a triple-bayed arch, as we've seen many places elsewhere. So also the thing about triple-bayed arches that I wanted to mention is that oftentimes they're along a little bit busier of roads or wider roads, whereas single-bayed arches might be along more of a ceremonial route. So could be a difference there too, between choosing 1 bay or 3. We don't really see 2-bayed arches. Yeah. Can't really think of any examples, but it's 1 or 3, odd numbers only. But this is the Arch of Tiberius. So it is a triumphal arch. We don't see really any images of peace, though, of the aftermath of the triumph, of stability after that. We see lots of military imagery here. So we see battle scenes, we see captives, kind of bound and displayed, looking sad. We see actual trophies, like spoils of war and trophies of battle. So it's kind of still, it's not the aftermath of the battle, it's kind of the current battle. The battle is still going on in the imagery on this arch. It also has these engaged Corinthian columns on it. And it's also kind of a general arch. So it's not commemorating necessarily one thing, but it represents battles with different people. So it's not like the conquest of this person. We see Gauls, we see more Germanic tribes people on it. It's not necessarily for one purpose or one people. If we look a little bit closer, so you can see some of those. These are some of the trophies here, some of the items of war, maybe some shields or something. And then if we look here, this is along the top panel, so up here, up top, we see a whole battle frieze. So a very dynamic, dramatic battle frieze, just sort of a mix of people all done in not super high of relief, although we do see that idea of depth, that some people are in lower relief and then some people are in higher relief. So it's a way of creating depth to the scene and making it seem like these things are going on at the same time, but in different places in the scene. So for instance, this man here is in much higher relief than the people in the back. But yes, very dramatic. We see people falling off their horses, people who look like they've already been slain, and then people who are in battle specifically still fighting. And we see kind of Baroque expressions here. So, people looking kind of in anguish or something. And it's just funny because it was built under Tiberius, right? And that was when we see his villa at Sperlonga, which is kind of a revival of Hellenistic forms. And so we see that again here. It's kind of a little bit of a hinting at the Hellenistic that I think that Tiberius might have had a kind of affinity for. So very dramatic battle scene that we see. We move on. This is a little bit different. So this is a temple. It's called the Maison Curie. And it is a temple to Gaius Caesar. I'm reading the inscription. Gaius Caesar, son of Augustus, consul, to Lucius Caesar, son of Augustus, consul designate, to the princes of youth. So this is essentially a temple to the Julio-Claudians, to the sons of Augustus. So it was built under Augustus's reign, but it was built likely when people still thought that one of his sons would succeed him. So, which doesn't end up happening because Tiberius ends up succeeding him, but it's dedicated to his 2 biological sons who would end up dying. So it's kind of for the future emperor. It's in a way a case of emperor worship, which again, we don't see really in the city of Rome. Augustus doesn't want to claim his family is divine in the city, but in the provinces, people can kind of do whatever they want. They can kind of take his subtle hints as they may. And so that's what we see here is the temple to the Julio-Claudian family, essentially. But it looks very Roman, as I said. So it, Nimes, which is where it's located, which is also where the Poncho Guard was. So as I said, that was a military colony. It was founded from the ground up. And so it also had this temple built around the same time. And it's a textbook example of a Roman temple, essentially, and it's very well preserved today. So you should be getting lots of Temple of Portunus vibes from it. But you can see, just so we've gone over temple design so often, but it's always good to point out again. So it is rectangular in plan. It has a single cella, and then it has that deep porch with columns in the front. It also has a staircase in the front. There's no staircase around the side. It sits on a very high podium. And then in the back, it has these engaged columns. So it's a pseudo-peripteral temple, just like the Temple of Portunus as well, pseudo-peripteral. And it is in the Corinthian order. So that's a difference from the Temple of Portunus. This one's in the Corinthian order. You can tell by the column capitals. And then it would have had an Ionic frieze. You can see that it would have had coffers in the ceiling of the porch. So coffers with those kind of rosettes in the middle. And deeply fluted columns also here, consistent with the Corinthian style, really emphasizing that verticality in something that is otherwise much more horizontal because it's a rectangular structure. If we look a little bit closer, so here's the plan. Like I said, an open cella. You can see a little bit better from this how deep that porch is, and then we have that large staircase, and also the idea of its podium that it's sitting on, quite a high podium, and then it would have had some acroteria, which no longer exist, but that would have probably crowned the top. We do see something a little bit different that we don't see everywhere. It's the egg and dart decoration style. So egg and dart refers to this pattern that we see where there's these shapes, these sort of rounded shapes, which look like eggs, and then darts that kind of dart between them, I guess. So egg and dart, where do we see it here? Yes, so here it is. It's essentially a type of molding. So you can delineate each different register or each different part of the architecture with this egg and dart type of molding. So we see that here, just another design kind of style to note. We see it a lot moving forward in other art as well, but just a lot of decoration on this temple, a lot of Corinthian decoration. So we see the acanthus leaves in the Corinthian order, and then we see more vegetal designs here, similar to the rosettes of the coffers. So lots of natural imagery kind of marked by this egg and dart design. And if we go back to the Arch of Tiberius, we actually see the same design here. That egg and dart design is represented on the top panel there too. So something that we see in France, and I'll point it out if we see it anywhere else. But yes, egg and dart design. Similarly, we also see the Temple of Augustus and Livia. So again, dedicated to members of the imperial family, something that's more accepted to do in France because it doesn't seem like it's them actually saying that they are divine. It's other people saying they're divine, and I guess that's okay. So this is in Vienna. This is actually an ancient city that was taken over by the Romans. So it wasn't founded from the ground up like Nimes was. It was originally dedicated to Augustus alone, but then in 41 CE, the Emperor Claudius decided to also include Livia in its design because Livia was his grandmother. So he was directly related to Livia, whereas he was not blood related to Augustus. So he's kind of honoring his own bloodline, trying to make it a little bit more legitimate, right? Because, oh, well, my grandmother is also divine, right? So I'm okay to rule. All part of that Julio-Claudian propaganda, right? And so if we look at the two of these, yeah, we do see just the way that the imperial family was celebrated in the provinces, but we also see very traditional designs in the sense that there's not much here that's not traditionally Roman. We're not really seeing any deviations here. This looks like, like I was saying, like the Temple of Portunus. I mean, yeah, there's some differences, but those differences aren't provincial differences. They're not differences because we're in the provinces. They're just like Corinthian versus Ionic order. So really traditional forms of Roman architecture that have essentially just been transplanted into Gaul. Okay, so that's going to do it for France, and we're going to move forward into Britain, and we're going to be looking at Britain for the rest of this class. There's a lot of great stuff there, and part of that just comes from the fact that there's a lot of people in Britain who, over the years, have studied Roman culture, and so we have a lot of people doing research on the Roman remains in Britain as well, because there's a lot of art historians and archaeologists who are British and study the Roman world. So in Britain, one of the first things we're going to look at, speaking of Claudius, is a bronze head of Claudius. So you might remember that Claudius was the one who finally conquered Britain. So Britain, the island of Britain, was finally incorporated into the Roman world under Claudius around 50 CE. And this one, though, is a little bit funny because if we compare it to, the one that we looked at from Italy, the portrait of Claudius we looked at, we definitely see some differences. So there are some similarities. They have similar hairstyles, that Julio-Claudian hairstyle. The ears that stick out are British. Claudius looks a little bit younger, maybe. He looks, but he still looks very Augustan. He looks kind of like Tiberius, maybe a little bit more. But we do see some regional variation in the style that it's all done in. So I would say that the portrait of Claudius from Italy is much more realistic, as we've talked about. It's starting to get into that veristic sense of portraiture, but it also is just a little bit more naturalistic too, where if we look at the Claudius from Britain, he's a little bit more abstracted. So there's the forms of his face. For instance, if you look at like his brow line, those are kind of just like lines in a way. And his eyes are somewhat naturalistic, but not as naturalistic as the one that we see in Italy. So there's a little bit of a simpler, more abstracted design to the face in Britain that we see versus a higher degree of realism and naturalism in our portrait of Claudius from Italy. So some differences, some stylistic differences, which could be derived from local British art, perhaps, but definitely a regional difference. Something else that we're going to look at, and we're actually going to talk about this for a little bit. So one of the only surviving Roman lighthouses exists in Britain. So it's in Dover, which sits on the coast, since most lighthouses do, right? So this is the Dover Castle Lighthouse. And as I said, it's one of the only standing ones that we have left. So we can learn a lot about Roman lighthouse design. Although it is one of the only standing ones left, there were many other lighthouses in the Roman world. And this is something we haven't really talked much about yet, so I kind of want to talk about their design. It's not super well preserved today, but we can see that it is generally in a conical shape. So it's widest at its base, and then it's going to slope upward, and it's going to taper as it does that. So it's widest here, and then it's going to taper at the top, and then at the top is where it's going to have some kind of flame. And we're not really sure, we don't have it existing still, so we're not really sure exactly how that would have been contained or what it would have looked like, but there would have been some kind of fire burning at the top of this lighthouse, which is the light part because they don't have electricity, so they're just going to use fire. But yeah, so it's going to be on the coast, you know, signaling to people where land is. If we look at the inside of it, we also see a sort of staircase system. So it would have been in wooden. So we don't see that anymore, though the wood has since deteriorated, but we can see the niches in the walls that would have held that structure, that would have held that staircase structure in place. And very important because that's how you go light the fire, put out the fire, whatever, maintain it, is that you need to get up to the top of it. So we're going to see a staircase system leading up to the top. So this is a conical lighthouse, as I said, but it's kind of a unique design. It's not really a design that we see other places in the Roman world. So as I said, we see a lot of lighthouses, but we don't see them in this conical shape. What we normally see is them in a stepped shape. So they're going to have multiple levels that are delineated. So this is the lighthouse at Portis, which is essentially right next to Ostia, right next to Rome. So Ostia, we've talked about, is the port city of Rome. Rome is a little bit inland, it's on the Tiber, but if you follow the Tiber out to the ocean or the sea, the Mediterranean, you'll get to Ostia, and that's the port city. But as Rome expanded and as its population grew and just grew as an empire and became more of this trading hub, they needed to expand. So Portis was built. Portis, which is another city near Ostia, it's another harbor. So there's multiple harbors outside Rome now, Ostia and Portis. And this one, Portis, had a lighthouse. So we can see it's not left today, there's nothing left of it today, but it was depicted in lots of artwork, and this is only a fraction of it. So here we can see it on this mosaic from the Square of the Corporations, which is kind of like a forum. It was kind of a place where lots of business took place, business offices and things, and it sat around this square, this piazza. So it's from the 2nd century, and we can see a depiction of the lighthouse that would have stood at Portis. So it would have been stepped, as I said, multiple levels, kind of tiered like a wedding cake, and then we can see that it would have had a flame at the top also, so that's the light part. And we can see that it's sitting here on the ocean. The lighthouse at Portis actually would have sat on a man-made island. And so again, kind of a testament to Roman engineering, the fact that they could make these islands and build up this harbor. And then if we also look at the Torlonia harbor relief, so this is a relief panel. There's a lot going on here, lots of maritime activity. So you can see this massive ship right in front. And then behind that, so the ship might be coming into Portis, it might be coming into the harbor, and it's passing this lighthouse. And so there it is again, and you can see that it's also stepped. It has these different layers with the flame at the top. And so you can see that it looks similar to this one. So that was the Portis lighthouse. And this was the more commonly accepted shape. This was much more common, much more often seen was this stepped shape rather than that conical shape. So this is the one at Portis. And then if we look at Corinth, Corinth also had a lighthouse. Nothing really exists today. We just have some of the bits of its foundation. But this would have been also on the harbor, right on the water. I think I mentioned last time that Corinth was one of those really busy port cities that became wealthy from its trade. And so although we don't have the lighthouse, we can see it on this coin. So the similar imagery to the Torlonia harbor relief and actually the mosaic, where we have these ships passing in front. So maybe they couldn't really render waves here. So we're having to have ships and this fish to make you know that we're on the water. In this case, we do have waves and we have a ship, and then we have a ship on this coin as well, signifying that this is a lighthouse. So, but it depicts specifically the one at Corinth. It was a little bit later of a coin because the lighthouse dates to maybe the first century BC, first century CE, and the coin comes a little bit later, but looking very similar. So that might make sense because Corinth is not too far from Rome, and there probably would have been a lot of interaction directly between Rome and Corinth, because I said that Corinth was kind of a stopping point between Rome and the rest of the Roman East. So perhaps that's why we're seeing some similarities here, and that it's closer to Rome, and so they're going to look more similar. But we also looked at Caesarea Maritima in Judea, and although we don't have anything left there either, just archaeological remains, as well as textual sources which often describe what these things looked like, we can see that it looks similar to the one we just looked at, where it's stepped. So it has different layers like a wedding cake, and they kind of go in, and then there's the fire at the top. And this design, especially the stepped design that we see in Rome and in the East, all gets its inspiration from one of the wonders of the ancient world, which is the Pharaohs of Alexandria in Egypt. And this is actually a Hellenistic construction. So it's from 280 BC. So it's not necessarily Roman, because Egypt wouldn't have been under the Romans at this point. So it would have been still under the Ptolemies. But it is a lighthouse. It was one of the biggest in antiquity, and it was probably the one that inspired all of these other ones. So we see it on a coin, similar to how we saw one on a coin at Corinth. And we can see that it's quite tall, but it does have those different tiers in a way. But it's a more elongated version than we saw at Rome or at Corinth, right? So that bottom tier is going to be a little bit taller, similar to the one at Caesarea Maritima, right? That really tall base. But yes, so we see multiple layers here. There's actually 4 different layers. So the bottom is going to be a square base. So if you looked at it from above, it would look like a square. It's the really tall one. And then the next one up is going to be octagonal. It's going to be octagon shape. And then on top of that is a cylinder. And then on top of that is where the thing containing the flame would be. So quite tall, also sitting kind of on an island jetty type thing. And like I said, a massive monument, a very well-known and famous monument that no longer exists today. However, they have done underwater archaeology. So archaeology under the water, they go down with scuba divers and submarines and excavate down on the ocean floor. And we have found some of the remains of the Pharaohs of Alexandria. So that's what you're looking at here. You can see the beams that would have held it and all of the materials, the blocks that would have held it. So I posted on Canvas, but also the link is here to a YouTube video that shows someone scuba diving and going around the site and looking at all the underwater remains. So you might want to check that out because it's pretty cool. You kind of feel like you're there. So although it no longer exists, we still have many of its materials. But just to remind you, so the 2 kind of main shapes that we see here are a stepped lighthouse or a conical lighthouse. The stepped one is also going to have a staircase system, or in this case, it looks like a ramp system on the interior, similar to the Dover lighthouse, but their external shapes are going to be a little bit different. So again, perhaps a difference in provincial architecture that we see Alexandria really influencing Rome, and then that form being exported to places like Corinth and Caesarea Maritima. But here at Dover, we have a little bit different. We have a more conical shaped, a little bit more of a provincial, unique style. So continuing in Britain, we talked about this already, but I just wanted to remind you, since now we're actually talking about Britain, Hadrian's Wall. So Hadrian's Wall was built in the reign of Hadrian, and it delineates the northernmost border of the Roman Empire, and that is going to be way in the north of the island of Britain, almost to the Scottish border today. So you can see it, that's that pink line on the map. And Hadrian's Wall was very important because, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, there was constant threat in the Western provinces. There were many tribes, indigenous Britons, indigenous Gauls, whatever, who were constantly coming into conflict with the Romans wanting to take their land back. One of the most famous is the Revolt by Boudicca, who is a British queen. She was the queen of this British tribe and rallied these people to revolt against the Romans. And unfortunately, it was crushed by the Romans, unfortunately for Boudicca, but she is kind of a hero now, or a legend, especially in Britain, as this legendary queen. So Hadrian's Wall, that was why Hadrian's Wall was built, was a defensive feature, but we also see garrisons being set up in Britain. And that's a lot of the archaeology, the Roman archaeology that we have from Britain is military garrisons, things associated with military. Lots of the finds that we have, the artifacts, are also associated with the military there because it needed lots of troops to maintain the area. You know, they're so far from Rome that they really had to set up camp. They really had to establish a presence there to make it clear to all of these tribes that they had conquered the area and that they were not to be messed with, that they had a heavy military presence holding down the fort, quite literally. So let's look at this. This is one of the best well-preserved garrisons that we have. It's called Vindalanda, and it is also in the very north of Britain. So it sits essentially on Hadrian's Wall. If we look at this map, so the green line is going to be Hadrian's Wall, but this was founded in 85 CE, so it was actually founded before Hadrian's Wall was built, because like I said, Britain was conquered under Claudius, but then Hadrian's Wall was obviously under Hadrian. So Vindalanda, before Hadrian's Wall, was another defensive feature set up at this border to kind of secure the area. And it specifically sat on a very important road. So you can see the road network with the blue dotted line. It sat on this road, and its primary function was to protect that road. And so that they could get supplies in and out, they could move their troops around and not be attacked or you know, looted or anything by local tribes. So Vindalanda kind of sat on that road as a defensive feature, but it really was like a whole town. It wasn't just a fort or an outpost, but it was a whole, essentially, town set up. So it had lots of buildings, it had gates, it had, you know, kind of on a grid system. It looked a little bit more like a town, not as big as a town, but it had some of the same features. But Vindalanda is perhaps most famous for its tablets. So these are the Vindalanda tablets. We have tons of them, like hundreds and hundreds. And they are a great record of life in a Roman military garrison in Britain. A really great look into military life in general, also just what the concerns were of people, how people lived, what they were thinking about, because a lot of these tablets are very personal. They're just personal communication between you know, people. So some of the things that they talk about, they contain records of business transactions. One of them talks about the awful state of the Roman roads in Britain. They're like complaining about how terrible the roads are there. Personal letters home. So people in the military, men in the military, writing to their families back in Rome, asking them to send them socks, shoes, underwear. So all kinds of just letters, basically, of daily life that are found at Vindalanda, and many of them have been translated and are still being translated. You can see that they're quite small, so they're kind of like letters, and they have also a bit of a special script. They're written in Latin, but the actual style of writing is kind of unique to this area. And these Vindalanda tablets. But one of my favorite tablets is this one, which is an invitation to a birthday party. So it is from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, and it is the earliest example of a document written by a woman in Britain. So it's the earliest writing from a woman that we have in Britain, and it's from 100 CE. And this is Claudia Severa, who was a commander's wife, and she is writing to her friend in a different fort, also in Britain, but a different friend, or a friend who lives in a different fort, who is married to a man who works there, and she's writing to her asking her to come to a birthday party. So kind of cool, really, again, just everyday life that we get to see through these tablets, and interesting because it's not necessarily typical Roman life, but it is typical life on a Roman military garrison. So sort of a specific type of town, of people who are living there, women married to military officers, for instance. And that is something also that we have learned from Vindalanda, is that these military garrisons were not just for soldiers. So it wasn't that these soldiers would be stationed there away from their families. In some cases they were, but other times the families came with them. And we also have tons and tons of shoes that we have found from Vindalanda. And one of the biggest things that we found out from that is that there were children there were women there, because we see shoes from all different types of people. So they have baby booties, little tiny shoes for babies, women's shoes, men's military shoes. We see all of these different things for different types of people. So again, these military garrisons were not just military camps or forts, but they were kind of mini towns, and really places that these soldiers lived with their families while they defended the border. So we're kind of able to learn more about Roman life than just the typical like male soldier perspective. We kind of get their families as well, children, women, a more full picture of Roman society here. The other thing that we see a lot in Britain, so the two kind of main sources that we get our information from are military garrisons like Vindalanda and massive villas. There's lots of estates, large villas, mansions in Britain. Many of them have extensive bath systems. So we have some well-preserved baths from Britain. There's actually a town called Bath, and it's named for the Roman bath that sits there, and you can go tour it today. It might even be a still working bath. I'm not sure. But yes, so lots of villas with their own infrastructure. They were self-sustaining kind of mansions with private infrastructure, but also lots of decorative elements as well. So here's one that we have. This is a mosaic that we're going to talk about. It is called the Low Ham Mosaic. It's from the Low Ham Villa, located in Somerset in Britain. And this is a little bit later, so it's in the mid 4th century. So we're getting a little bit into late antique art here, but still really important, so I wanted to talk about it. It is a narrative mosaic, so rather than mimicking maybe wall painting where you just show one scene from a myth, it is more of an episodic narrative where you're going to show the same people in different scenes doing different things. So it's that comic book idea again, where you're seeing the same people in different scenes and different registers doing different things. And in this case, it depends on where you are standing. You have to walk around it. This would have been placed in the middle of the floor, but you know, part of it is upside down, as we can see that if you walk in this way, those people are going to be upside down to you. So you have to kind of walk around the mosaic to get the whole story. And what does this mosaic show? It shows the story of Dido and Aeneas from the Aeneid. So I was talking earlier at Carthage. That was the place that Dido was the queen of. And Aeneas, during a storm, gets blown off course, or he's kind of, I don't even know if he's on a course, he's kind of just sailing in the Mediterranean trying to figure out what to do. But a big storm hits and he enters Carthage as to find safety. So that is the first thing that we see on this mosaic. So it's this long side of it here. We see men in boats and they are sailing to Carthage. So here we see someone kind of holding on to a ring. So they're sailing into the land. Aeneas and his troops. So it's kind of setting the stage, right? It's the first scene of this narrative. And then next up, we see Aeneas on land, and we see him meeting Dido. And this meeting is facilitated by the goddess Venus. And Venus is Aeneas's mother. So he is half divine. He has Venus as his mother, and then he has a mortal human father. And Aeneas also has a son who he had in Troy, Ascanius. And so Ascanius is also here. That is the child. And something interesting to note is that they have these Phrygian caps on. So these Phrygian caps, which might make sense because Aeneas is from Troy. So he's kind of a foreigner. He's kind of from the East. But it's a little bit weird. And there's a thought that this mosaic is closely associated to the cult of Mithras, or the idea of Mithraism. So we've talked about cults before. We've talked about cults with Dionysus, that Dionysus had a cult. We saw at the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii that this cult ritual was taking place. And so that was a similar idea with Mithraism, but it was centered around the god Mithras. And Mithras, M-I-T-H-R-A-S, Mithras was actually an Eastern god. So he was not immediately part of the Greek pantheon or even the Roman pantheon. He was this Eastern god who had been incorporated into the Roman pantheon of gods. and he was closely associated with the sun, which kind of made it a little bit awkward because the Romans already had a sun god, as did the Greeks. But Mithras was also associated with the sun in this Eastern religion, and so he sort of retains that connection when he makes his way into Rome. And the cult of Mithras, so again, we had these cults, which are people who are specifically devoted to this god. And there's lots of rituals that go along with that, and traditions and things. And Mithraism really comes into popularity actually around the same time as Christianity. And there's actually people kind of talking about the rivalry between these two cults, that it's sort of like these big religious changes are happening, you know, and some scholars have even postulated if things could have gone differently, if a large portion of the world today would be part of the Mithraism religion. But because Christianity took over so much, that Mithraism died out essentially. But at this time, in the mid-4th century, and also prior to this, we really see Mithraism as a cult among the military. It is very strong with people in the military, and it's almost like the people in the military had this special devotion, and if you join the military, you might also join this cult. And so it was sort of a special link between Mithras and the military. So the point of that, and why I'm talking about that here, is that Mithras was always depicted with a Phrygian cap, because he was an Eastern god, he was from the East. And so I guess the way that he dressed was like he was from the East. So he wore a cap looking just like this. So the fact that we have this mosaic in Britain, which we know was pretty much only primarily occupied by Roman military forces and their families, but pretty much everyone who was Roman in Britain was part of the military. And people in the military were very closely associated with the cult of Mithras, and a lot of them worshipped Mithras. And Mithras dressed with this cap. We see those connections all coming together in the Loham mosaic. So we see Aeneas here almost in the guise of Mithras, but also you'll notice he's dressed like he's in the Roman military. So he's got that kind of pleated skirt that we've seen, those big shoulder armor. And so we see a blending there. And so there's lots of references that we're seeing here to military life and to the cult of Mithraism, which is also wrapped up in military life. So this is the first scene, Venus introducing Aeneas and his son to Dido. Venus, as Aeneas's mother, is very concerned for his safety, and there has been, his fate has been told that he is destined to go found Rome. This journey that he's on in the Mediterranean, he's destined to eventually go found Rome. And Venus is very worried about that, and she's worried about his safety. And so she wants him to stay with Dido in Carthage so that he stays safe, away from danger. And so she is facilitating this meeting, and she is even going to send her other son, Cupid, to make Aeneas fall in love with Dido. And so these two are going to fall in love. They go on a date. They go hunting on a date. So that's what we see here in the next panel. So we are moving around here. We were first at these ships, and then here's their meeting scene, and then now they're on a hunt. And Aeneas is kind of looking back at Dido as she's on a horse, and you can tell because he has that darker skin and she has that lighter skin. We've kind of talked about those gender differences in skin tone. And so here they are, they're frolicking on a hunt. And this all takes place in the Aeneid as well. And in the story, what happens is while they're out hunting, a big storm comes, lots of very like fateful storms, right? A storm blew him to Carthage, and now a storm is hitting here. But a big storm hits, and Aeneas and Dido have to take shelter in a cave. And things get pretty sexy in the cave. And so they end up sleeping together in the cave. And Dido falls even more in love with Aeneas. And because of this, she has decided that they must essentially be married, right? Because, I mean, they slept together, so now they're married. That's kind of how this works, right? He wouldn't sleep with her if they weren't married, so they must be married now. So that's what we see in this scene. Again, moving along the panels, we see the two of them embracing, and maybe here, I don't know, it doesn't really look like a cave, but maybe there's some trees, so maybe this is part of it. And again, if we look at Aeneas, he has that Phrygian cap again, so that's kind of a reference to Mithraism, but he's dressed very much like a Roman soldier. And Dido is not wearing anything at all. So kind of definitely some gendered differences here. Perhaps again for the Roman military, a bunch of military men maybe making this, not sure. But it was definitely something to be seen by members of the military who would have understood the iconographic reference of the cap. And we also see references to Mithras in this central scene. So the central scene, the center woman is a little bit up for debate. We think it's probably Venus because she kind of resembles Venus in the other panel, but she is flanked by Cautes and Cautopates, who are the two kind of right-hand gods or minor gods of Mithras. They are his little companions, his kind of helpers. So there's a bit of blending here because they do look like cupids or like little putti, like cherubs, because they have wings, but they also look like they could be associated with Mithras. They're always holding torches, and one of them is holding a torch up, and the other one is holding a torch down. And because Mithras is closely associated with the sun, usually it's thought that maybe the one holding the torch up is representing the sunrise, and the one holding the torch down is representing the sunset. So he's usually flanked by these two. We don't see him here. We see a woman who might be Venus, and that might be because of the idea of episodic narrative, that we have certain characters in this scene. And so we're keeping with those same characters, like Venus is still a character here, and so she's gonna be in the middle. But it's a little bit unclear. But also we see her nude. She's holding her garment behind her and kind of on the contrapposto pose, but she's looking a little bit seductive, as we saw. If she is Venus, we saw her earlier. She's kind of adorned with this jewelry and also nude. So Venus as the goddess of love, maybe living up to her name or her association. As for Aeneas and Dido, it's funny because the story does not end in the mosaic. So we don't see the conclusion of the scene or of the story in this mosaic. We don't see what happens after, which is that Dido, who's in love with Aeneas, wants to marry him, thinks that they kind of already are married, right? Well, he has another fate. He is fated to go found Rome, and news of their relationship starts to spread, and he starts to be very conflicted about what to do until he is visited by Mercury, who is the messenger god. The messenger god is sent by Jupiter, and it's kind of Jupiter's plan for Aeneas to found Rome. So Jupiter sends Mercury to remind Aeneas of his duty, to remind him that he needs to go found Rome and he can't stay here with Dido. And Aeneas, being the good Roman soldier that he is, with his loyalty to the Roman state, and his priorities of Rome and of this sort of greater good, he leaves Dido, he sails away, and he goes and founds Rome. And Dido is so anguished over this. She's so terribly sad that he has left her that she ends up committing suicide. She has her sister build a funeral pyre, and then she jumps onto it and is killed there. So also lots of layers of gendered issues here, and that these two characters are in love, but Aeneas, who's conflicted between his duty to the woman that he loves and essentially the Roman state, goes on to choose the Roman state in the end, and the woman ends up committing suicide. And again, if we think about that in the context of Britain, of military soldiers creating this, we think that, maybe they didn't want to depict the sad part of the story of Dido killing herself, but they wanted to really emphasize Aeneas as this, typical and heroic Roman soldier. And Aeneas is not, with his Roman outfit, and he wouldn't have been dressed like that, in the Trojan War, because Rome hadn't existed yet, but he's wearing the outfit of a Roman soldier at this time. So lots of connections there. That is going to do it for us. Next time, we are going to catch back up with our emperors. We're going to go back to Rome. We're going to be looking at the successors to Hadrian, the Antonines, and we'll be looking at their dynasty, and that's kind of where we're headed for the rest of class. But as I said, also, we're going to be looking a little bit more at some specific forms of art, including, or really most notably, funerary portraiture. So that will be coming up as well, but next time, the Antonines. So see you there.